On the 14th of September 1970, a trial began at London's Old Bailey. The trial had received the most advanced publicity and interest at the time since the abolition of the death sentence in the United Kingdom back in 1965. 2 men were brought up from the cells below to the historic dock of the No. 1 Court. The 2 men stood in the dock were Trinidadian-born Arthur and Nizamuddin Hussain. The trial, sensational and historic at the time, as this was the first time in the United Kingdom's history where the accused stood trial for murder despite there being no body found, and it was also the first trial in the modern UK judicial system for a kidnap for reward crime. Originally from the port of Spain, the capital city of Trinidad and Tobago, their father, Shafi Hussain, was a highly respected tailor who owned the family home in Trinidad. Shafi was a deeply religious man and was heavily involved in the local mosque which served the needs of the local Indian Muslim community. The 2 brothers had subsequently been raised according to the teachings of the Quran, the Muslim Bible. Together with their sister Hafiza, the brothers along with Arthur's wife Elsa and their 2 children moved to a farm named Rook's Farm in Stocking Pelham near Epping in Hertfordshire in May of 1968. The modest 12-acre property was purchased with the aid of a mortgage for £14,000, approximately £260,000 in today's money. The farm itself was largely uncultivated and the only livestock consisted of a few pigs, calves and chickens. Incidentally, pig keeping hardly commended itself to the family's faith since pigs are considered unclean by Muslims. Unable to make ends meet with the vast overheads associated with farming and the lack of farming thereof, Arthur depended on his tailoring skills and sewing machine which he used to make trousers for London's East End tailors. Nevertheless, Arthur possessed delusions of grandeur and fancied himself as the local squire, spending freely in the local bars, even attempting without success to join the local hunt. At his trial, Arthur named his occupation as fashion designer and was frequently referred to in his local neighbourhood as King Hussain. The 2 brothers Hussain plotted a plan that was ruthless and brutal, a scheme whereby they would kidnap the wife of a wealthy Londoner and then by utilising menace sought to extort vast amounts of money from the husband. Arthur had noticed a luxurious chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce driving around London bearing the registration plate ULO18F. Taking note of the registration plate and at his brother's prompting, Nizamuddin went to the County Hall where the Greater London Council had held the particulars for all motor vehicles in the London Metropolitan. Nizamuddin made an inquiry to establish the owner of the Rolls-Royce. Unlike today's world of strict data protection laws, this was a relatively straightforward inquiry. Nizamuddin made the inquiry in person, but given false details as to his identity, he told the clerk that he needed to trace the owner of the Rolls-Royce, as the Rolls-Royce had sustained minor damage after colliding with his own vehicle, and he was anxious to contact the owner to make amends. As a result of the inquiry, the 2 brothers were furnished with the information that the Rolls-Royce was registered to a large news corporation, namely the News of the World, and was the company transport for the company's chairman, a young Australian millionaire and entrepreneur named Rupert Murdoch. The News of the World at the time had the largest circulation of any English written newspaper, as this was an era where news predominantly spread via printed newspapers and thus was a very profitable publication. The brothers carried out surveillance on the Rolls-Royce, tracking its movement from the News of the World's office and following it to the wealthy and prosperous London suburb where the car would stop at 20 Arthur Road in the suburb of Wimbledon. They watched on as the Rolls-Royce deposited its occupant at the house, known as St Mary House, and presumed the occupant who left the Rolls-Royce and entered the house must have been Rupert Murdoch, and this lavish property must have been the private residence of Mr. Murdoch. However, the man in the Rolls-Royce was not Rupert Murdoch. In fact, the property itself wasn't even the home of Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch had in fact left the United Kingdom a short time before to embark on a business trip to Australia and had let the use of the Rolls-Royce be taken up by the deputy chairman who would take lead role at the News of the World during his absence. The man the brothers Hussains were mistakenly targeting was in fact Alec Mackay, and the house, 20 Arthur Road, named St Mary's House, was in fact the Mackay residence and had no connections with Rupert Murdoch whatsoever. During the early evening of December the 29th, 1969, around 6 p.m, the brothers Hussain put their plan into action. Using some pretext to enter the property, since Muriel Mackay always left the door on the safety chain, the brothers quickly overpowered Mrs Mackay and forced their way into the property. Soon enough, the overpowered and petrified Mrs Mackay was taken away. At the trial, the Attorney General pressed the fact that the brothers Hussain fully believed that they were kidnapping Mrs Murdoch, when the reality was she was safe and sound in Australia. Around an hour after the kidnapping, Alec Mackay returned to Arthur Road to find the front door forced open, and upon entering the property, he discovered items that the intruders had left behind. There were some sheets of newspaper, a roll of twine, a piece of sticking plaster tape and a bill hook. A billhook is a tool that resembles a hybrid between a knife and an axe, commonly used by farmers for hedging and ditching work. The billhook becoming an important link in the evidence trail later on in the investigation. The phone was on the floor but had not been ripped from the wall, an indication that the brothers' time in the house was quick and that Mrs. McKay had been overpowered in little to no time. Interestingly, Muriel McKay's glasses, handbag, wallet, keys and chequebook were laying around the stairwell. Some short time before, the property had been burgled, and Alec McKay's initial thoughts were that the previous intruders had returned in order to abduct Mrs. McKay, hence the twine and other items, plus the abduction. But on reflection, the question has to be asked, why would the intruders have left behind items of value if they had returned to burgle the property for a second time? The context needs to be set here. Can you picture a woman sat in the comfort and safety of her own home, sat beside the fire, waiting for her husband to return for the evening, and then someone forces entry into your home, gags and trusses you, and then bundles you away into the cold dark night? It's a truly horrifying situation to picture. Around 5 hours after Alec McKay had returned to the property, the phone rang at the property and Alec McKay answered the call. On the other end of the line, there was a voice introducing himself as Mafia Group 3 from America, or M3 for short. The conversation was candid and to the point, with the caller stating, "We tried to get Rupert Murdoch's wife, we could not get her, so we got yours instead. Have £1 million ready by Wednesday night or we will kill her." Adjusted for inflation, £1 million in 1969 would be over £17 million today. During the following few weeks, there were a further 18 phone calls made to St Mary House by the kidnappers. The calls were answered by Alec McKay's son Ian, who had moved into the property to spare his father the anguish and the stress of the calls. Especially as Alec McKay had a serious heart condition, and others worried that the excitement and stress of speaking with the kidnappers could prove for his heart condition to be fatal. During one of the calls, Ian was to the point and stated, "Frankly, we want to know if she is still alive and well." He went on to further say, "We have the money, but why should we give you the money if we do not know if she is still alive?" This angered the voice known as M3, and he responded with, "I have told you what she was wearing. What do you want me to do? Take her clothes off and send them to you?" Now clearly agitated and frustrated, M3 now said, "If you do not cooperate, you will get her back dead on your doorstep." Ian McKay's repeated request to speak with his mother, or even a compromise of having her voice taped to provide proof of Muriel's continued existence, went wholly ignored. 3 letters were received, 2 addressed to Alec and 1 to their daughter Diane. One of the letters read, "Alec, my darling, I am blindfolded and cold. Only blankets. Please do something to get me home." After the 3 letters, there was never any further communication directly from Muriel McKay. During one of the phone calls, Ian broke his calm demeanour and became increasingly agitated at the kidnappers and shouted down the phone, "It's because you don't have her. You have a corpse. You are trying to trick us. How many other people have you kidnapped before?" The reply from M3 was a very ominous one. "We have never murdered anyone as yet, but there will always be a first time." A letter was received addressed to the editor of the News of the World, postmarked the 9th of January 1970, written in block capitals on a single sheet of white line paper with no signature. The letter asked the editor to inform Alec McKay that they had his wife and would provide proof, and that they demanded £1 million. The letter further read, if they failed to cooperate, that Muriel McKay would be disposed of. The kidnappers did indeed send some pieces of the dress, coat and shoes that Muriel was wearing at the time of the kidnapping. For the British police, the kidnapping and demand of ransom was a novel crime, as no such crime had been recorded in the United Kingdom since the 12th century, where King Richard the Lionheart had been kidnapped and held to ransom. It was otherwise in other countries, such as the FBI in America and some other European countries, where more experience in kidnapping and ransom had led those authorities to put the safety of the kidnapped person first and the capture and detention of the abductors in second place. For the British police, this was effectively the first of its kind in the modern day, and thus no scenario that there was no training manual available and there was no previous cases in which lessons were learnt in order to reflect back on. The lessons that the American authorities had learnt, and a practice that had largely worked well with the desired outcome, was the rule of pay the ransom to ensure the safe release of the kidnapped, and to then pursue the kidnappers once the hostage had been released. This was usually the case of a kidnapping, but it also must be noted that the other countries experiencing kidnapping for ransom had also involved a professional career criminal who was highly organised and experienced. The normal procedure for a career criminal being that leaving the ransom note with their intentions and demands at the location of the kidnapping, in order to both leave no guess as to why the hostage was taken and what would be required to have an amicable outcome for all concerned. There was a shadow of doubt at this point that was thrown onto Muriel McKay's kidnappers though, as no such ransom note had been left at St Mary's house on the night of the kidnapping, throwing doubt onto the professionalism of the kidnappers, and no note was left, and the police were hampered somewhat by this, as regular hoax calls would be made to the house as a result of the high profile of the case and the widespread coverage in the newspapers. The police at one point beginning to doubt if Muriel McKay had ever even been abducted, and indeed at one point considering the increasingly plausible case that Muriel McKay may have had a degree of involvement in her own disappearance and had in fact gone to Australia of her own free will. Indeed, one of the lead detectives, DSC Smith, was asked if he believed the police were investigating a genuine kidnap for ransom, and his reply was, "How do we know? We've never had one before." Naturally, the profile of the case, that being the kidnapping of a high-profile member of society, but also that the original target was also of high importance, and that both the target of the kidnapping and the subsequent actual kidnapped had husbands of high social standing and wealth, meant that the case attracted a lot of media attention. For the first 2 weeks in 1970, there was no contact from M3, no doubt alarmed by the amount of media attention that the kidnapping had attracted. Then, on the 14th of January 1970, the phone calls with M3 were resumed. 6 days later, Alec McKay received a letter directing his son Ian to travel to a public call box outside London on the Cambridge Road on the evening of February the 1st, where a call would be made to the box at 10 p.m. The call was to give directions for where to take the ransom money. This was further reinforced with a letter received on the 26th of January 1970 repeating the directions to take, along with pieces of Muriel McKay's clothing and the threat that Miracle would be executed if Ian failed to keep our business date without any error. On the evening of February the 1st, Detective Sergeant Street took the place of Ian McKay and attended the call box as instructed, where he was instructed to proceed to another call box and receive further instruction at 10:45 p.m. At the second call box, the detective was instructed to look on the floor of the call box, where an empty cigarette packet on the floor contained instructions to travel to a location called High Cross, beyond which there would be a road junction marked by some paper flowers. This was where the money was to be left. The detective carried out the instruction and, with another officer watching covertly, kept watch over the money, even though it was left next to some paper flowers, so the location was certain. The result, after the police determined a reasonable amount of time to have elapsed, they collected the money themselves and returned back to Wimbledon with the money. The next day, Ian McKay received a call from M3 accusing him of double-crossing the kidnappers by going to the police, as the kidnappers had noticed a police presence in the area of the drop-off the day before. Later that same day, M3 called again, saying he would no longer do business with Ian McKay and would only deal with Alec McKay, instructing him to pack the money into 2 smaller suitcases, and on February the 6th, Alec McKay followed a similar call box procedure to deposit the money. This led the police to a location called Bishop Stortford in Hertfordshire, where the suitcases were placed by the hedge on road leading out of town. Here was where the kidnappers' luck finally began to run out. A security officer who had no doing with the kidnapping nor the investigation happened to drive past the seemingly abandoned suitcases on the side of the road and subsequently travelled to the nearest call box to call the police, and then he returned to keep watch over the suitcases until the police arrived. Meanwhile, the 2 Hossain brothers had been cruising around the area in Arthur Hossain's Volvo car and drove past the location of the drop-off several times and deemed it far too risky to attempt to claim the suitcases. This was not, however, before the police had seen the Volvo and the number of times it had passed, arousing suspicion. They noted the number plate and traced the vehicle as being registered to an address of Rooks Farm in Stocking, Pelham. The farm and the farmhouse were subsequently searched, and although no trace of Muriel McKay was found, there was compelling evidence found that linked the brothers to the kidnapping. This included the paper flowers that matched the ones left at the collection point, with one of the brothers' girlfriends stating she had been shown how to make them by a patient while working as a nurse at the local hospital, along with other compelling evidence, such as a notebook with a sheet torn out that matched exactly the piece of paper used to send the letter to the News of the World. The ransom notes had their handwriting matched by a handwriting expert to the same handwriting as the brothers, and a palm print that was found on a newspaper at St Mary's House from the night of the abduction was matched to Arthur Hossain. Rooks Farm was searched in all places: fields, the farmhouse, outbuildings, rivers and streams, but there was no trace of Muriel. But with the mounting and overwhelming evidence, the 2 brothers were consequently arrested on suspicion of murder. At the trial, the first prosecution witness to take the stand was Alec McKay. By this time, and following what had clearly been a very traumatic experience, a pale and shaky Alec took to the witness stand, saying that the last time he had seen his wife on the morning of her disappearance, she was a very bright person. Alec McKay was followed by a string of witnesses who confirmed every step of the Attorney General's story of events. Everyone who had spoken to M3 on the phone, from the operator who connected the first call to the editor of the News of the World, and all members of the McKay family that had had interactions with the event, all testified. Fingerprint and handwriting experts identified all of the artefacts exhibited in court as belonging to either Arthur or Nizamuddin. A neighbouring farmer from Hertfordshire testified that he had been missing his billhook after visiting Rooks Farm in October of 1969. When shown the billhook seized as evidence from the McKay residence, he waved at the billhook and exclaimed, "That's my bill. I defy anyone to tell me that it's not." Both the Hossain brothers defended themselves and both gave evidence in their defence. Both the brothers denied all knowledge of the charges they faced, but each brother tried to pin the blame on the other for any happening or circumstance for which they were questioned. When questioned about the billhook, Arthur stated he did not recognise it and that the farmer had made up the whole story. However, On being pressed on the matter, he did admit to borrowing a bill hook to cut up a calf that had been brought to the farm. From time to time during the prosecution's examination, Arthur burst out into wild accusations against the police, citing police brutality, claiming that after his arrest the police had frequently beaten me. Nizamuddin, on the other hand, testified that he was in fact scared stiff of his elder brother. He confessed to going to County Hall to inquire about the Rolls Royce, saying that it was Arthur who provided the registration details and also the bogus name and address for the inquiry. Nizamuddin also stated that his brother gave no indications as to why he needed the information, and even after obtaining the information, he did not give it another thought. During the summing up of the evidence, the judge, Mr. Justice Sebag Shaw, mentioned each of the relevant points, and he told the jury that each point is perhaps small in itself, but from that, an edifice is slowly erected one by one, brick after another tiny brick. The Attorney General summed up his closing statement with, "The Hossein brothers had devised a brutal and ruthless plan to kidnap a wife by menace and extort from her husband a vast sum of money." Clearly, when the jurors returned after a mere 4 hours of deliberations, they held the same sentiment as the judge and Attorney General, returning a verdict of guilty on all charges, but they did, however, recommend Nizamuddin to leniency. After the passing of the verdict, the judge asked the brothers if they had anything to add. Nizamuddin remained silent, but Arthur again burst out into hysterical denunciations at the judge. When handing out the sentence to the brothers, the judge gave grave words to the men in the dock. The kidnapping of Mrs. Mackay was cold-blooded and abominable. She was snatched from the comfort and security of her own home, and so long as she remained alive, was reduced to terrifying despair. This crime will shock and revolt any like-minded citizen, and the punishment must be so sanguine so that the law-abiding citizens feel safe in their own homes. There cannot have been a worse case of blackmail. You put Mrs. Mackay's family on the rack for weeks and months in an attempt to extort money from them by the most monstrous demands. Both of the brothers were sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Muriel Mackay, and on the remaining charges, Arthur got 25 years and Nizamuddin 15 years for kidnap, and a further 14 years and 10 years respectively for blackmail and sending threatening letters, with all the sentences to run concurrently. Among the spectators in the crowded gallery was old Shafi Hussein, who had travelled to London for the trial. With a stupefied look, he said, "I can still not believe my boys would have done this. I am sure they're not guilty." However, one thing that was abundantly clear was that both brothers were convicted on an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence. However, there was one factor that would bother the Mackay family and leave others baffled for years. The brothers Hossein were convicted for murder, yet no body was ever found. Not at Rook's farm or in the surrounding areas, despite one of the most thorough and prolonged searches carried out at the time. For the next 52 years, there was nothing more than speculation and rumours as to what had happened to Muriel Mackay. At the time of the trial in 1970, there was speculation that Mrs. Mackay may have been murdered, dismembered and fed to the pigs on the farm, but had that been so, evidence such as remains of bones would have been present at the farm. Another theory being that the body had been cremated in the fireplace at the farmhouse, but in both theories there was no forthcoming evidence. Another theory is that Mrs. Mackay succumbed to the cold, harsh winter and died from exposure, with the theory that her death may have been accelerated by the fact that Mrs. Mackay did not have access to her prescription medication. It was also deemed plausible that Mrs. Mackay was never even held captive at the farm, and that the brothers had established a hideout in the nearby Epping Forest, and after her death Mrs. Mackay's body was weighted down and dumped in a river or even out to sea. There were only 2 people who knew for definite where Mrs. Mackay led, and with one of the brothers likely to remain in prison for the rest of his life, there was only one hope of persuading Nizamuddin Hussein to reveal where the body had been laid in exchange for a reduction in sentence and potential early release. One time when visited in prison by Arthur's wife Elsa Hussein and pushed to talk about the events and the possibility that there may have been a third party, Nizamuddin replied enigmatically, "Arthur says we must never talk about that, because if we do, the children would be in great danger. There would be reprisals." However, in January of 2022, the cool case became active again when Nizamuddin, now 75 and back in Trinidad after being deported after serving 20 years of his sentence, said he was ready to identify the land where Mrs. Mackay had been disposed and buried at. By this time, Arthur had remained in prison until he died behind bars in 2009, so there was only one witness left, and likely without the fear of reprisals from his brother, the now elderly Nizamuddin was ready to talk. He agreed to talk to lawyers hired by the Mackay family, initially by letter communication, before finally agreeing to a Zoom call with the Mackay family. Nizamuddin started by saying that he wanted closure before he met his maker. After 50 years of heartache and speculation, the family hoped that they may have finally found the answers that they had been looking for. Nizamuddin was adamant in stating that no violence had taken place at any stage of the kidnapping. There was no physical violence and she was not tied up and sitting behind me and chatting with me in the back of the car, he went on to say. At the farmhouse there's a wooden gate. There's a few wooden gates. It has a barn beside, barn beside, and 10 foot forward, 10 foot this side from the left, the body's somewhere around there. Next to the barbed wire fence, about 3 foot from the fence. He also protested that nobody had killed Muriel McKay and that she in fact died whilst watching a news bulletin covering her kidnap and disappearance whilst in the company of Nizamuddin, and it was suspected that Mrs McKay had died from a heart attack due to lack of her medication. Nizamuddin also went on to say, "This will forever haunt me for the rest of my days," adding that he had fed fried rice to Mrs McKay after kidnapping her. Nizamuddin also agreed to talk to Mrs McKay's sister Diane, 81, in a video call. She said, "I was dreading speaking with him. At first I wrote him a letter and I couldn't do it. I felt physically ill. Since then I've got more into it and eventually I was able to front him up on a Zoom call. He told me he wanted closure before he met his maker. I felt utter relief when he said she's buried at the farm. I've just thought about it so much over the years. For years I had terrible dreams of them throwing my mother into the sea. We haven't had a good Christmas since it happened. To me it's a horrible time. It's the anniversary of it happening, and New Year I find particularly upsetting. We always went abroad at Christmas so we could avoid the issue." Diane added, "It's also there in the back of your mind somewhere. It makes you more anxious. I locked the doors and moved abroad to somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I retreated to a very isolated place. You didn't know whether to cry or to accept. It was a very confusing emotion. You cannot grieve, you cannot accept, because there was no body." When he told us those details, he said where it was, how to get there, how many steps. It was quite a lot of detail, and I thought, my God, he's telling the truth. He can't be making this up. However, with the new evidence and after a week-long search for Muriel, the police once again called off the search after digging up several areas of Rook's farm, whilst the family found comfort knowing that Muriel McKay hadn't been exposed to any violence. To this day, the body has never been found, which leaves the question, does this still remain a murder mystery?